So natural selection is the process in which traits that provide a benefit become more common in a population due to survival of the fittest. So let's understand this by looking at some examples. And we'll start with a really simple example. And so I'm going to create a scenario where I have an environment, and the environment is light colored, so this white background. And we have a population of dots. So we have white dots. So we've got some white dots in here, and we've got some dark dots. And we're going to start with a population that is 50-50. So due to random genetic mutations, some of the dots are white and some of them are black. And again, this is an environment in which the environment is white. And so let's imagine that there is a visual predator. That means a predator that hunts based on sight, and it thinks these little dots are really tasty. So in this scenario, the visual predator will have an easier time hunting the dark dots because they stand out in a white environment. And so you would expect that these dots would tend to get eaten more. So white dots also get eaten, but the dark dots are easier for this predator to find and eat. And so over time, the white dots would survive longer and reproduce more. So this population is having more of these white dots. And some of the surviving dark dots, they might have some offspring. But we can see that over time, if this keeps happening, instead of being 50-50 white and black dots, this population would shift to being all or mostly white dots because they are more fit for this particular environment, right? So in this particular environment, the white dots have greater fitness, they survive and reproduce more, so evolution would result in a population that has more of the white instead of the black dots. Now, to make sure we really understand this, though, let's consider an alternative scenario. So we have an environment, we have 50-50 dark dots and light dots, just like the previous scenario. Oops, get that one colored in a little bit more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. So again, this is 50-50 of white and dark dots for our starting population. But imagine that instead of a white environment, we had a dark environment. So I'm going to color in this environment. The environment is dark, not white. So picture that all super, super dark colored. I won't keep coloring here, but we also have a visual predator. But in a dark environment, the dark dots blend in more and the white dots stand out. So they are more easily hunted by the predator. So these are my white dots getting eaten by the predator. The dark dots sometimes get eaten, but because they blend into their environment, they're less likely to be eaten. So over time, the dark black dots reproduce more because they survive longer. They don't get hunted as often. The white dots might still reproduce, but because they're getting hunted more easily, there's less of them. So in this environment, right, so again, the dark environment, we would see a shift to having a population that is all or mostly dark dots. So in this environment, dark dots equals the most fit. So remember that fitness is dependent on the environment. So lastly, let's look at another example. So here's my dot population, and again, we're 50-50 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 50-50 dark and white dots or black and white dots again in a white background. But here's the big difference. There is no visual predator in this scenario. So is natural selection going to occur if there's no predator? Well, not based on this particular trait and this particular interaction, right? So without a selective pressure, i.e. the predator, there would be no change in this population. Not by natural selection. So over time, we would expect the population to stay 50-50 light and dark, okay? Because without the visual predator, there's no selective pressure for coloration. So again, the environment is super key to what trait is most fit and whether natural selection will occur, right? So without a visual predator, we have no natural selection occurring. Let me give you one more example. So last example here with the dots. So what if my population was all white? So what if my population was all white and I had a dark background? Okay, so 100% white dots in a dark background with a visual predator. Okay, I'm just going to put a line here to emphasize I'm now talking about this example. So visual predators present, white dots in a dark background. So theoretically, right, a dark colored dot would have an advantage in this environment. Okay. So what is the result of natural selection going to be in this scenario? So again, I'm going to color in that dark environment. It is still 100% white dots. Okay, so why? Why do I get no change? So highlighting here that there would be no change, right? Why, when earlier I had a dark background, did I get a change to black dots? The difference is variation. Are there any dark dots in this scenario? No, right? So there's no genetic variation. Variation is the raw material of evolution. Without variation, we cannot get evolution to having dark dots, right? This little white dot can't say, gee, if I was dark colored, I would be able to hide from this predator and become dark. No, we can't change our genetic traits. We have the traits that we have. And because this population is 100% white dots, they all have the same color, there's no way for a dark dot to get selected for. Okay, so without variation, natural selection cannot occur. So how could we get variation? There would have to be a random genetic mutation. Do mutations always produce beneficial traits? No. Okay, so when we get random genetic mutations in coloration, it's not going to just automatically be the really convenient color of dark, right? It could be, for example, bright pink, right? Would that be a good mutation in this scenario? No, right? So mutations are just as likely to be negative. Now, only by chance, by random chance, might some of them be a dark mutation, in which case then the dark colored mutation would potentially be beneficial in this environment and cause it to shift to a population with more black dots. So let's take a look at a really classic example of evolution, so getting away from my dot example, but to actual organisms. The birds in the Galapagos Islands have become kind of the classic example of evolution. Darwin collected samples of the birds on the Galapagos Islands, and they would eventually support his theory really well. So when you're talking about an island, islands, is in the case of the Galapagos and many other types of islands, form from volcanic activity in the ocean. So they form out of nothing, right? So they come out of the ocean and rock. And first they're bare rock, right? So a little bit of background about islands to understand this example. Volcanic islands start as bare rock, and they must be colonized by living things. And so those living things have to get there. So they have to come from the mainland or some other nearby site, like another island. Okay, but generally they're coming from the mainland. So when you have a new island, you're going to get a small population that arrives on the island from the mainland, right? So this is when the island has newly formed. On the mainland, okay, so thinking about the mainland first, the mainland is a very large area, and there's a lot of different food sources. So back on the mainland, your birds have a lot of variation. And in this case, we're focusing on beak size. So the beaks on this mainland population, there's big beaks, there's little beaks, there's skinny beaks and broad beaks. So you get all kinds of different variation in the beaks due to genetic differences, so passed on from the parents. And on the mainland, this difference didn't really matter because on the mainland, there was a lot of food, right? So this one could be good at eating big nuts. There was lots of big nuts on the mainland. This one could be good at eating little nuts, but there's also lots of little nuts on the mainland. So as long as your resources of your environment are diverse, then the diversity of beak size is maintained. And that's what we see on the mainland. And so when they first come to the island as well, from the mainland, they bring that diversity with them, right? So at first, the population has diversity, right? So diverse population, and this is, again, inherited from the mainland birds. And then when they first get to the island, there isn't a lot of competition because there aren't that many of them. So as long as there aren't that many of them, you're still getting long beaks, broad beaks, big beaks, little beaks. You're still seeing a lot of diversity. But as they reproduce, competition intensifies, right? So again, over time, you start to have limited resources. So that means more competition. And as there's more competition, you start to see some of these offspring where at first you had the diversity, you start to have less that survive. So that's where we're here now, right? So maybe these original birds had a lot of offspring, but a small number of them survive. And let's imagine that the island that we're talking about, there's a predominance of a plant that makes large seeds. So on our particular island, there are more large seeds. If there are more large seeds, then birds with the big beaks will be able to eat those large seeds more easily because their big beaks can break them and chew them. If it's a big nut, so imagine if my seed is this big and I have a bird that has a beak that big, it would be impossible or difficult for the bird to eat that seed. Whereas if the seed's that big and the bird has a beak this big, it's going to be able to eat that seed just fine. So that's why they relate to each other. Okay, so on this island, there's more large seeds. And so what we see is that the birds with the bigger beaks are starting to reproduce better, right? So they survive longer, okay? So less of them survive overall, and the ones that do survive are the big beaks. Whoops. So there's an increased survival rate for big-beaked birds. And because they survive longer, they reproduce more. Okay, so again, remember, more likely to survive and reproduce. So when there's more large seeds on the island, a big beak has greater fitness, to use our fitness term. Okay. And so our large-beaked offspring that survived, these are those surviving birds, okay? So we went from high diversity in beak size right? At first they reproduced, there was a lot of them. Then we had increased competition, so the large beak ones survive. And that continues into the future. So we start to see the birds with the beaks, large beaks, are the only ones who survive. And then over time, there may be other traits that accumulate as well that are different. So you can see that over time, not only do we have more big beaks, but we also have a brown color. And that brown color might arise through a different natural selection process, so maybe camouflage or something like that. Or it might also just be a random trait that arose and traveled with the large beak trait. And that's something we'll talk about later when we're studying evolution. So the result of this process, okay, so to sort of recap, after many, many generations, because of the environment that has larger seeds, large-beaked birds are selected for. They're more fit in this particular environment. And so the result of evolution for this population of birds is a large-beaked bird. So we could also use that term adaptation that people have heard. So adaptation, evolution adaptation on this island results in a large-beaked bird. Now, what if the island had had small seeds instead? So a different island So if you think about that for a second, if there's small seeds on that island, then small beaks are going to be more suited for eating those small seeds. And so on that island, you would expect to see selection for small beaks. And so what we see on places like the Galapagos, so in island chains like the Galapagos, so you have an island here, an island here, an island here, an island here. You have your mainland that the birds all went to the islands from, is that each island, depending on its food source, ends up with a unique type of bird. So you might have a big beak on this one, you might have a little beak on this one, you might have a medium-sized beak on this one, but each type of island ends up with birds adapted to that specific island. And so even though the islands are really close to each other, they all have their own unique species, which was one of the things that Darwin observed, right, and helped support his idea of natural selection. So again, what is fit for an environment or what is fit traits depends entirely on the environment, even these little microenvironments of islands within an island chain.